Okay, good day everyone. Thank you for attending our fourth webinar in our GDPR series. I'm Geert Beekmans, Chief Risk and Security Officer for SD Worx, and I will be guiding you to today's webinar with, as a topic, integrating security and privacy controls or measures in your HR processes. So we're taking a bit the non-legal side today into account. You can ask questions throughout this webinar using the box on the right-hand side of your screen, and I will also address those towards the end of the webinar. We would also like to encourage you to use the hashtag at GDPR Countdown and the handle at SD Worx on Twitter to give feedback. And if you have further questions, you can also contact us at weareglobal@sdworx.com. As with the previous webinars, this webinar will also be recorded and will be sent via email and will also be available for download afterwards. The presentation and also our GDPR International report are also available for download. And you will also have the opportunity to rate this webinar at the end, which will help us again in improving the upcoming sessions. So, today, the fourth webinar, and we'll be focusing a bit more on the security measures or controls around the data. So with all the legal complexity and legal measures around GDPR, we sometimes forget also that it all turns around data protection and protecting the data. So having the right controls in place is really critical on that level, and that's why we want to also touch down on this subject a bit. Yeah, let's kick off. So first, a bit of introduction on what GDPR is saying on this level, and it's basically very flexible. So the main process here is Article 32 is the security of the processing, and basically says that the controller and processor shall implement appropriate technical and organizational measures to ensure a level of security appropriate to the risk. Now that's very generic and does give you a little guidance. It, however, also continues a bit and also includes further guidance saying that you can take into account the state of the art, which basically means the level of security that's available within the technology that you are using. What does the available technology allows you to take from measures to protect the data? The costs of the implementation. So when assessing which measures to take, of course, costs are also important. And depending on the size of the organization, depending on the sensitivity of the processing, that cost element is certainly also something to take into account into the equation. So it's not that you have to implement measures at all costs as such. Then the third one, nature, context, scope, and purpose of the processing. That means also the whole context around what type of data are you processing. Is it sensitive data concerning special categories of personal data? Do you do any profiling? What do you use it for, etc.? It will all play a role in the evaluation of selecting the appropriate security measures. And then as a last one also, the risks for the natural persons involved. That basically means what is the impact in case of a leak for the individual and his data. Typically, we assess risks from a company perspective, from an enterprise perspective, and here the law demands you and asks you to also take the risk from an individual perspective with you, which is something that most companies do not have the habit of doing. So we'll take a bit of adaptation of most risk frameworks as well. That's basically what Article 32 says. So very general, very generic. So it doesn't provide you with any normative framework and a list of security measures that you at minimal should take. Personally, I think it's a good thing. It would have been a lot more harsh if you have a really fixed normative framework, because then you cannot adapt those measures anymore towards your own context, towards the own activities you have. So I think it's very positive and good that GDPR provides you with the overall flexibility to choose your own measures. On the other hand, of course, that comes at the price of the responsibility and the burden to select the appropriate measures. So you will have to assess your risks and you will have to select the appropriate technical and organizational measures, which is, of course, more work than having a checklist of measures in front of you and just having to implement all of those to ensure that you're compliant. So it's a two-edged sword, I would say. In other hands, in the summary, I think so. It's basically an introduction further of the risk management principles into the privacy world, and that means that we will have to do a risk assessment. A lot of people have a bit of trouble with that one. I get often questions, certainly from IT folks, but also from others. Like, does GDPR say we must perform logging of read actions on this system, and how long do we have to keep them? Well, GDPR doesn't really say something on that. It says that you have to assess that for yourself and see if you think you need that logging and if you should be able to implement that or not. Is it still allowed to send personal data via email? Well, GDPR does not say anything on that one. It says that you have to evaluate that. So basically, you will have to see, is your email sufficiently secure? What if you send the wrong mail to or mail to the wrong recipient? Do you have controls around that? And then maybe it's still okay to use email. So there's no really hard normative framework around that, and that makes it a bit difficult for some people, and that also means that for every company the measures will be different depending on their own evaluation. Basically, that means also that you need as a company an adequate security risk management framework. So you will have to be able to demonstrate that you assessed your risks and that you documented those in terms of confidentiality of data, integrity, and availability. So that means you will have to be able to show some kind of risk matrix, the evaluation of the controls you currently have in place and what you think the residual risk is, and if that is acceptable for you as a company and for the process that you are running to process the personal data. It's not a one-off assessment either. GDPR also clearly states that it is expecting you to have a process for regular testing, assessing, and evaluating the effectiveness of those measures. So you will need to re-evaluate periodically your risks and the measures you implemented, if they are still okay, if they're still effective, and if they need to be improved or not. So that comes also with a more continuously management process. It also means upon changes, if you implement or execute significant changes or new projects, that you will have to evaluate for each new product as well if the measures that you took are still relevant enough, or if you have to add new measures, and if new risks are introduced or not. So I would definitely already check with your organization. Does your organization already have a standard risk management framework on security level or on enterprise security risk level? Who is responsible for that? Is anything documented already on that? And can you, from an HR perspective, already partly reuse that framework, or is nothing available, and will you have to do something on your own level? If you have to take one thing from all of this, I think that is what I strongly would recommend for all of you, and that is having a data security audit or review executed on your HR processes and the way you're protecting your HR data. So if you have an internal audit team or a security team, please ask them to execute such an assessment. If they're too busy, because in these times I can testify on that one, that it's not most security teams are overloaded. Or if you don't have direct access to one of those, then I would strongly suggest to take a look at an external consultant or an auditor to do a short assessment of your HR processes and the security around that. And that's something you can take initiative yourself for that, budget for that. Nothing prevents you as an HR department to initiate such an assessment, and it will immediately provide you with good view on where you are on the security level. Secondly, it will also be allow you to demonstrate towards any inspection or regulatory instantiation that you have evaluated your measures, you have documented that, and you are taking action on this level. So also from that perspective, from a documentation perspective and an accountability perspective, having such a security audit report of your HR processes is a really good thing to have. So strongly recommended. Now, another article that is relevant in this context on GDPR is everything around data protection or data privacy by design. Because in addition to Article 32 on the security of the processing, there's also an Article 25 and a Recital 78 that says that you have to take into account data protection controls when developing, designing, selecting, or using any products or services that are using personal data or processing personal data. So that basically means that you will have to integrate privacy and data protection compliance from the start, also in your HR project management lifecycle, in any IT activities that you do around this, and that you will have to be able to demonstrate that as well as of May, that when you start up a new project or you're developing a new service or changing existing things, that you, as part of your project approach and evaluation, you take those data protection requirements with you at every stage of the project lifecycle. Yeah, that means that the way we typically should work, I think, is that the best option is to include a mandatory section on data protection in a standard project initiation or requirement templates. So you probably have some project management flow or standard that you follow and templates that you use if you start a project or new initiatives. So I would make sure and align with your project management office or with others to ensure that you have a one-page standard section in there that acts as a trigger when you start up a new project, and that obliges you also to fill in a number of basic elements in a project initiation document and in any requirements templates you might use. And that will then be used or can be used as a first impact assessment upon project initiation to see if there might be any high risk on data protection and if you need to do a further more deep assessment or take additional measures, or maybe consult with your data protection officer or your security team on, because you think there might be important elements as part of your project initiation assessment. So also it will serve you as documented evidence if you ever get a check as well, that as part of the process you take it with you. So it's strong evidence as well towards any issues you might have later, that you seriously considered any data protection requirements and elements as part of every project. As I mentioned in the beginning, please do not do this assessment only from the enterprise perspective, but also put yourself in the shoes of an individual, of a data subject, and ask yourself then the question, what might be the risk for an individual if something goes wrong here? So take both perspectives with you. And then also, it doesn't stop, of course, with defining those requirements. Please make sure you also test those before you go live, and keep also a record of those tests and what the outcome is. So you can also demonstrate that later. That's basically what I would strongly recommend to adapt there. Where I think you should talk to the people that are managing your project management standards or managing your HR projects. Now let's dive in the measures themselves a bit. I will walk through a few basic elements which I think that from an HR perspective, everybody of you should be able to take and to follow these measures because they're not that complex and because they are generally accepted as a best practice across the processing of personal data in general, and also in the security world considered as being the norm. I will not go into really detailed stuff here. Of course, there is a lot more in terms of security controls and security assessments to look at. But if you would already follow those and take this as a basic checklist, then it will already prevent a lot of accidents. I just got a message that we cannot hear you. Is that still valid? Are you still all hearing me? I don't see any. Yes? Okay. Yeah. Okay. Lots of reactions here, so apparently it's okay. Yep. Okay, I'll continue then. So, first of all, without going into specific measures, the question I always ask towards when I'm walking around in our own offices or being at other customers is a bit of self-assessment check. If I see things that go wrong or that are not okay from a security perspective, I try to challenge people and ask them, would you do that with your own data or that of your best friends? And that's a very good question to ask yourself from time to time. So you have to challenge yourself. What could go wrong in terms of confidentiality, integrity, or availability? So don't just assume it will be okay. Ask yourself also the other question in terms of what could go wrong potentially, and try to think from a negative perspective. Do we then have sufficient controls in place to prevent such a thing from happening? And if it was my own data or the data of my best friend or family, am I willing to explain and defend these controls and measures to them? If your answer to that last one is, not really, or I'm in doubt, then you know you're in a weak position and that you should look at further measures. Of course, it's subjective, this one, and everybody will look at it from a different perspective, but it's a basic check that most of you easily can make from time to time. And if everybody within an HR department would from time to time have the reflex to ask himself, am I okay with doing this if it would be my own data, then I think you already have made a big step. Secondly, on this level also, I sometimes see the natural reaction of, the security measures and stuff, that's all quite technical and IT, and it's the job of IT and the security manager. Well, hey, we'll walk through the measures now, but there is quite a lot you can do yourself or initiate yourself, though. So don't just sit back and lay back in a position and wait until somebody of IT or of your security folks come knocking on your door to ask you for questions. Take it into your own hands. It's also your responsibility that your HR data is secure on this level. Now, first one, all pretty evident, I think, when you're working in your own offices. That should not surprise anybody, I think, but ensure that there's a clean desk and clean screen principle that is enforced within HR. Often, it's not always that rigorously enforced, although most of us know the principle. We not always apply it, and we also sometimes think like, okay, we're in our office, it's a protected environment, what can go wrong, there is no issue. Well, but we can have visitors, we can have potential customers walking around, and they could see confidential information of other employees on a screen, on a desk, or papers that are floating around, etc. So even it's not because you're in a secured office building that you should not take into account clean disk and clear screen principles. So basically, if you leave your desk for any length of time, the rule should be any paper or portable media containing confidential information should not be in plain sight, and your workstation should be locked. Also, if you just walk to the coffee machine, go to the toilet, just make a habit for yourself to just lock without anything. That's the clearest you can say. And if you stop working for the day, clear your desk. It's a fun exercise to maybe start with, in the sense that wait until most people are gone home and then just walk around the HR desks of your HR department and see what's around, floating around of information. You'll be surprised in most cases on what you find. And I think there it's something you can easily enforce yourself. You don't need security or IT for this. Secondly, also make sure that if you still have a lot of paper information, and in most cases, most of you will still have a bit of confidential paper information, please make sure you use appropriate shredders or have secure disposal bins to dispose of this paper. And a secure disposal bin means that you cannot just get the paper out of it again if it has been thrown away. So please check that also, that in your HR department you have that in place, and enforce that also towards your co-workers, that any paper that is not public information, just shred it in or throw it into the secure disposal bin for confidential paper. That should be the habit. And thirdly, also with printing, try first not to print, of course. Try to keep a digital approach as much as possible. But then also, if you have to print confidential information, try to use secure printing features, like that you have to batch or type in a PIN code before the printer actually starts with the printing of the information. If you walk around, again, also there, do not forget the printer in the print room. There is always sensitive information floating around such an area. People print, get a phone call, forgot that they still had a print waiting on the printer, etc., and it keeps lying there. That's also something that should be avoided in all possibilities. And all modern printers today have that feature. It's maybe sometimes hidden, and it's maybe not enforced always by your IT department. If not, you could ask your IT department to look into if it can be enforced for your department. But if not, also from a people perspective, you could learn your people to use the secure printing features as a standard. So please take a look also at this one. If you just take those measures already, they're fairly simple, straightforward measures that everybody could take into account. You will already have quite a bit of less risk of inappropriate access to information in the HR department. The main message is basically make sure confidential information is not visible and accessible by anyone passing by. So that's basically the thing we want to achieve. Then secondly, those days, most of us are also sometimes working remotely at home or other offices. And it's also important to have clear rules around this one. So at first, make sure that you have a clear remote working policy, and that includes also on how your people have to treat confidential information. Certainly within HR, you should be used to having a remote working policy, I assume, but often it's more an HR-focused policy on what is allowed in terms of how long you can work at home, under what conditions, how do we have to register that, etc., etc. But not always there is a good link towards the security part of when working at home. So work together with your security team on this and make sure there's also clear rules in a remote working policy on how your co-workers should deal with protecting confidential company information when they work at home or somewhere other location remotely. Then secondly, make sure you never store your company information outside your controlled IT equipment and environment. And that sounds easy, but these days, just ask the question within your HR department, but how many people would today use cloud software tools like WeTransfer, Dropbox, etc., if they're still allowed on your network, of course? Use a USB stick or a personal storage device. Use maybe a non-company PC to connect to an Office 365 environment or a cloud-based tool of the company, etc. That's a high percentage. In most cases, you will find quite a bit of those tools floating around. I think it's really important to make clear agreement within your HR department as well on which tools are okay to use and which are not, and are controlled within your company and by your IT department. Because if you just start using whatever tool is available and allow users to select whatever tool is available, you will lose all control of the data that is uploaded and stored in those tools. So certainly it seems a logical one, but it is these days often something that just happens. And then third one, also keep your screen and confidential conversations private, also evident, but I see in a lot of open office environments, sometimes HR coworkers sitting next to other coworkers with the screen quite readable or accessible, or when you're sitting on a train or a public location or in a hotel lobby or etc. Yeah, there are all solutions for this. You can put a privacy screen on your laptop that it's not that easily readable for others that are standing next to you. And you can also issue clear guidance on what is allowed in terms of discussing confidential information. What you would expect is if you're having a confidential information on the phone, don't just start discussing that. If you're in a public space, walk to another room, or say to the other side that you will respond through email or instant message instead of doing the whole conversation on the phone where everybody can hear you that shouldn't hear you. Those are all basic, simple measures, but often forgotten. So on that level, also in terms of remote working policy, maybe what is allowed within your company and what is considered okay to take information with you, to leave it in a car or a vehicle or not. What do you do in hotel rooms? What do you do with checking on public transportation, etc.? There, check with your security team and make sure you have clear rules around this. Also, how will your people delete information? I just talked about shredders in the office. How do you do that when you work remotely? Please make sure your people, when they print or take paper information home to work at home, that they do not just put that paper-based information on the street together with all the other publicity information that they have. No, they should take it back to the company and destroy it in a secure way, or make sure they have a shredder at home then. So that's also often forgotten. And then access to your data. In terms of, first of all, physical access, you probably still have a paper archive. Well, make sure that your archive is well protected and ask periodically for a copy of the access logs for validation and the access rights. Often not done. Most HR departments will assume that the access towards the archive is well secured, but not a lot of them ask periodically the list of people that are still allowed to access or the access logs. Most of those batch systems have that available. So please do that. Make from time to time the requests, ask for your access logs and review them. If you do that on a consistent basis, it will become quite easy in the end. It will not take that much time, and it will ensure you that your physical access to your archive is okay. In terms of physical access towards the HR department itself, it depends a bit. I sometimes get the question on, do we need to be physically in a separate secured area? It can be an option. I think an open space is also still feasible, but you will have to take additional measures then and make sure that you're not you still are able to have confidential conversations somewhere in a closed area, and that the space where the HR folks are is not too mixed with others, given the nature of the data you're working on often. But it doesn't mean you're not able to work in an open space. It just means a bit more attention on how that open space is set up, and there definitely is a clean desk is then even more important. The same way with physical access, but then with access to your HR systems and data. Well, of course, I'm not sure if some of you still have shared user accounts, but please do not do that. Make sure everybody uses an individual user account and chooses a good password. But also from an HR perspective, something you can easily do and request to your IT department if they do not push that to you towards yourself is, from time to time, request them with a report of who has access to the different HR systems and with a copy of the access log on who has logged on to your HR system in the past month or the past 3 months, and validate that one systematically. Once you start doing that, the first time you will probably identify quite a few things that you were not aware of. Often is assumed that the security administration and access procedures will be okay, but if they're not regularly reviewed, then you will certainly bump into people that shouldn't have that access, or that were left from previous functions and were not changed, etc. So make it a good habit to request periodically a report of the access rights, something you can do yourself. Also, do not forget unstructured data there, and not only the applications, but where do you store also personal data of your employees, on shares, on document sites, on shared mailboxes. Also take those into account and also periodically review those. Those are difficult, often more difficult even to secure appropriately. And then thirdly as well, I would really look into the option of using more stronger authentication for HR administrators. Within SD Worx, we have been working quite hard the past few years on providing more stronger authentication options, and we are continuing that roadmap. And we will be pushing things towards using stronger authentication as a standard means. It should become the standard for an HR professional, I think, that has access to the data of hundreds or thousands of employees. Then it's certainly, if it's a cloud-based environment, you should not just be accessing that with only a user ID and password mechanism. So challenge your providers on that one. Ask them if they have stronger authentication mechanisms available, and make sure those are implemented and used, so that if a password is leaked, that does not immediately lead to a data leak or a breach of a few hundred or thousand people's data. For HR professionals, that should become the norm towards the future, in my personal opinion. And then still a word and a caution on email, in my perspective. Difficult to prevent email and for mailing data towards all kinds of locations. I think it's still okay to use email as long as you secure it in an appropriate way. But I would first look into it if there is no alternative available. If there is an application or a good other way, like a secure FTP or a portal to share the data in a more secure way, then I would strongly suggest to only use that mechanism. If you do not have an alternative and you have to exchange documents, then please make sure you standardly password protect all the attachments and that confidential information. It's standardly often available. You can use a zip file with a password protected encrypted password on that, or also in every Office document you can put an encryption with a password in there. It's just you should create a habit of doing that, because a lot of incidents often are related to sending a document to the wrong recipient. It's really fastly done. You're typing into your Outlook you just start typing and you by accident select the wrong guy, send, and it's gone, and often with not so funny consequences. So please make sure that's a standard habit for attachment with a lot of people's data in there, that they're password protected. And also, I would ask your IT department to confirm that your email is encrypted when you transmit email, because it's not easily seeable. You will typically all are aware, if you connect to a web application, that it must be secure and that you should look if it's HTTPS and has encryption on it. Over email, there is the same thing that exists. It's called SMTP over TLS. It's also a secure channel to send mails from one party to another. But you cannot just see that in your Outlook. When you select just a mail or send a mail, it's difficult to see that. So please check with your IT department that they have enabled that one. And if not, ask them to do that, so that you're at least sure that any emails that are transmitted to any partners you work with outside your company, but also inside your company, are sent in a secure and encrypted way, and not just in clear text across the network or the internet. So just a screenshot to show that last one, where those are all features that are easily available, and I probably even don't require any action from your IT department or your security team. So please have a look at those and take that into account. So that was basically the specific measures. I wanted to run through them. Of course, there's a lot more if you start really doing a security assessment of your HR applications or your HR processes. A lot will come out of that, and you probably need your IT department and your security team to help you or assist you with taking additional measures. But all the measures I just mentioned, they should be easily usable for all of you and implementable for all of you. And it's a question of doing that and of having the discipline to do that. As an example, for example, with a clean desk, walk around in the evening. If you see confidential paper, just take it away and they can collect it with you, or just throw it away in the dustbin. If you do that a few times, you will see that people will start adapting their behavior and they will start to follow those rules. And a lot will depend on HR management showing the lead and providing the good example on that level. Yeah, in terms of questions, I'm open for questions now. So please pose any questions you might have around security of your processes, around security measures of our own SD Worx processes. I'm also available to answer those ones. The first question is around on encryption. If encryption is mandatory or not. Well, that's a good one, because the GDPR refers towards data encryption a few times, but it does not say that it's really obligatory. On the other hand, because it insists on encryption as a good standard measure, if you're not using encryption of data at rest when you store the data, or when using encryption of data in transmission, then you'll probably have to be able to defend yourself or explain why you're not doing that. So it makes sense to assess that if you can use encryption of your databases and the applications that the HR applications that you use, if they support data encryption or have implemented data encryption as a standard measure. It makes sense to request and ask that, but it will depend also on the underlying technology and if it's easily feasible or not. It will not be feasible for everything, likely, but at least do the assessment and make sure you check it. But it's not an obligation, that's for sure. Second question I see here, is it better to have an internal or an external IT provider? Purely from a GDPR perspective, I don't think there is a big difference. It will depend on the security measures that the IT department or provider takes. And it's not necessarily better with an outside provider than with an internal one. Of course, some HR departments choose an external one to ensure that internal people do not have access to any internal HR data. So if you select an external cloud-based solution or external provider that is managed, where the IT environment is managed by the external party, then by definition your internal IT people will also not have access to that one and will not be able to access that employee data. If you organize that internally, some of your internal IT people will need, of course, that access, but because they will need to be able to manage and support your HR applications in that one. So that's basically the trade-off, I think, a bit to make, but you can also have very good internal security measures. It's not that it's bad by definition. The question is, do you know what level of encryption is used in your example of encrypt with a password option? It will depend a bit. I think the standard Office documents, I'm not 100% sure of the encryption level with what Microsoft has implemented today in that one. The first recommendation I typically make is use a password protected zip file. That allows you typically to select the encryption method towards AES-256, which is basically the strongest standard on the market today, or one of the strongest standards, and which makes sure that you have a strong encrypted container for storing any documents in there. The advantage of the zip file is also that you can use it to store any type of document in there, and that you can use it as a encrypted container then to store those documents, whereas the standard Office documents, that's only for Office documents. If you have a PDF or something else or a text file, then you will not be able to apply that mechanism there. But normally with a standard zip encryption, you could use strong encryption based on AES-256, which is also still on the screenshot there. So and they're free zip tools. If you do not have one on your PC, you could ask your IT department, but they're free zip tools that support that do not have any additional costs, like, for example, 7-zip, that you can use to password protect and encrypt that document. Question, if we encrypt the file with a password, should we send the password separately? Yes, definitely. Do not send the password in the same email, because then it doesn't make sense to put a password on there. Make sure you send that separately. And by preference, even not using email, but through a text message or an instant message or something else, if that's available. If that's not available, you will have to fall back on email, but then please send it through a separate email. Not in the same email with the same document, so that if you by accident send it to the wrong recipient, then at least he's not able to directly open that one. There's a question also, could you give an example to what type of project this could apply in terms of, I'm assuming there the question relates to the privacy by design aspect. To any project where there is personal data processing involved and where you might have certain data that is touched or changing the way you process data, there I would definitely try to to use the basic principles of privacy by design and by integrating that into your project lifecycle. Also, even if there is no personal data touched, in principle, this doesn't apply then, but it's not a bad practice to make sure that you document security requirements and pose yourself the question on, do I have the right security measures in place, even if there is no personal data involved? It's okay, I think, there to do that, and it's a good practice to do it. So just integrate it as a standard means for every project is a good way to go with it. Of course, if there is personal data involved and if there are high risks that come out of the initial assessment, you might probably have to do a bit more and may have to start also a data protection impact assessment more formally to document all of that under GDPR. Just still walking to other questions. Yeah, in terms of the Worx applications, as I mentioned before, I think most of them already have the availability of stronger authentication, although it's not always standardly enabled yet. So if you still use a simple user ID password to access applications as an HR professional, then I would certainly do the check if stronger authentication options are already available and if those can be enforced and enabled. For your own employees, there it will depend a bit, and you will have to make the choice if you also want to enforce stronger authentication options for your own employees, or maybe use single sign-on solutions. So we also have for a few applications, single sign-on options available that allow your coworkers to, with one click, access the application that's hosted at our site through transparent logon, and that they don't have to remember and type in a user ID password anymore. And it's also secure access, because that means that if you disable a user account at your site when somebody leaves, then that access will also be immediately disabled for those single sign-on applications, which makes the administrative burden a bit less, and which provides you with additional guarantees that nobody is just able to access any data anymore. So also certainly available on that level. And definitely something to check. There's a question on how should we deal with hard copy or paper records. Yeah, from a security measures perspective, yeah, I would say make sure they're locked. If you have an archive, make sure you have a locked archive, and preferably it's secured with an electronic batch system so that you have an access log on who accesses at what moment the archive. For any other documentation, or if you have cabinets in which you store confidential information, please make sure those cabinets can be locked, those cupboards and cabinets are locked, and that the keys are only accessible towards your own people that need to get access there. Sometimes you see general cabinets available, but it's the same key on every cabinet in the whole company. Then it doesn't prevent a lot. Of course, it will still it's still better to put it into a cupboard out of sight than leave it on a desk invisible in plain sight. But it's not enough. You need to make sure it's in a locked cabinet there. If you want to throw away paper, as I said earlier on, make sure you shred it appropriately. And there are international standards on that one for which type of shredder is typically sufficient. I don't know it by heart, but I think it starts from a level P4 or P5, that it's enough for this type of confidential information. So also something to check. If you have a secure disposal bin to throw away paper in, make sure that it's locked and that not just anybody can pick up the paper again out of the bin, because then it doesn't, it's not good enough and it doesn't make sense then. Sending paper by post, yeah, there's also a question. Yeah, if you have to send paper by post, paper payslips. Yes, it's also something to take into account. Make sure you use the right providers there, depending on if you send it in a box through do a delivery like a DHL or a FedEx or whatever. If you do it by normal post, make sure you use envelopes that are sufficiently secured. You can typically use envelopes where you cannot just see through the envelope on what's written in there. That's something to check there as well, that is sufficiently, and that you don't, when you hold the envelope just against the window or the light, that you cannot just read stuff in there. So that's also maybe still a small point of attention. But I think typically, certainly within SD-Worx, we typically use, standardly use a secure type of envelope where you're not able to just see through the envelope. Any other questions? Then I think I will gradually close this session. I hope it was a bit useful, and it was a bit a reminder of basic security measures to attend to and to take into account. I think if you already go through the ones I mentioned and you strictly apply those, then you will already go quite far in avoiding accidents with leaking data. So thank you very much for joining. As mentioned in the beginning, the webinar will be available to be viewed again at our website. You can surf towards sdworx.com/GDPR/downloads for that. If we didn't get the chance to answer your questions, then don't hesitate to email us directly, and we'll get back to you on that one. Do follow our Counting Down webinar series and the next GDPR webinar that will take place in April, and will focus more on data transfers in an international context and how to deal with the GDPR in an international context also outside the European Union. Thank you very much. Good luck with your GDPR preparation, and stay tuned on Twitter and LinkedIn for further information.